So, symbiosis might not be a word that you've heard before, but you know that bio in the middle has something to do with life. Well, when we talk about ecology, ecology is the study of not only the creatures that live in a certain area, but the dynamics of the world around them. It's the interaction between the biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic being living things and abiotic being non-living things. So when we look at symbiosis, this is a relationship between different species. And the key word there is different species. It's not like two human beings helping each other. But as you can see in this picture, the shark and the remora, they're two different types of fish. Or the relationship you have with your pets, you're two different types of species. And when we look at symbiosis, there's three different patterns that we see in nature. And so symbiosis means these creatures living together and interacting with each other. Now, the one that most people are familiar with is what's called parasitism. Now, with parasitism, one is helped and one is hurt. So one species benefits, and that tends to be the parasite, and the other species is harmed, and that tends to be the host. Now, harm doesn't necessarily mean it's going to kill it. Harmed could just be that it's taking nutrients or things from it. So for example, a mosquito is a parasite. When the mosquito bites you, they then will inject a chemical into you in order to keep your blood from clotting, and then they turn around and they suck your blood back up. So they are getting nutrients from you, and they could be spreading a disease to you. A lot of mosquitoes cause the disease called malaria. So that's obviously going to be a parasite. A lot of people think of tapeworms as parasites, or ticks, fleas, things like this as parasites. This bird right here can be considered a parasite. Some of these birds will mimic baby birds, and they'll hide in the nest. And so when the parent birds come in, they'll mimic the baby birds and they'll steal food from the baby birds. So that could also be a form of parasitism. So the organism that benefits, like the flea or the tick, would be the parasite, and whatever they're feeding off of or whatever they're getting nutrients from is going to be the host. Now, another one that most people are familiar with is mutualism. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit. So the classic example is insects and flowers. You know that the insect, like this butterfly, lands on the flower and it gets nutrients from the nectar. But at the same time, the pollen of the plant gets stuck on the fur, the hair of this animal, of this insect. And so when the insect flies to the next flower, this helps the flower with pollination. This is an example. A lot of people say, oh, it's Nemo. It is an example of a clownfish and a sea anemone. Sea anemone belong to a group called Cnidaria, and they have what we call stinging cells called syndoblasts. And so a lot of sea anemones are toxic. And when we talk about like a jellyfish stinging you, you're actually just having an allergic reaction to the poisons, the toxins that these creatures make. And so this is a mutualistic relationship. Clownfish are actually slimy. And so when they rub up against the sea anemones, the toxin of the sea anemone does not affect the clownfish. So the clownfish is being helped because in a way the sea anemone is protecting it. It can live in the sea anemones, it can hide in the sea anemones, because a lot of creatures know don't attack a sea anemone, we're going to get stung. At the same time though, the sea anemone can also use the clownfish as bait. So other fish try to attack the clownfish. It will then swim into the tentacles, allowing the tentacles to sting the larger fish. Or as the sea anemone, or as the clownfish swims around, it's going to help dig up particles. And sea anemones can be filter feeders, and so they can help them filter those particles inside. We also have termites. Termites, as you guys know, eat wood. Well, what's very interesting is the termites themselves can't use that wood. The termites have a mutualistic relationship with a small protist that lives inside of their stomachs. So the termites eat the wood, but they're actually feeding this little protist that lives inside of them. The protist breaks down the wood, and then the termite can use those nutrients for its own gain. Okay. We also have things like E. coli in our own intestines. Now what we're seeing in this picture right here, okay, you're seeing some roots, and notice those roots look fuzzy. Okay. This is a relationship that we find is called a mycorrhizae. It's a relationship between a fungus and a root. And the fungi are heterotrophs. They are going to feed, and they will feed from nutrients that the root shares with it. And at the same time, the fungi help break down particles and put nitrogen into the soil. We need nitrogen in order to make DNA and RNA, but nitrogen gas is actually poisonous to most creatures on Earth. So right now you're breathing in nitrogen, you turn around and you breathe it right back out. So the nitrogen we get to make our DNA is from the foods we eat. Well, plants don't eat. Plants create their own food, but they still need nitrogen in order to make DNA. So this relationship, the fungi, when the fungi gives off waste products, it's going to contain liquid nitrogen, which is then absorbed by the soil. And then the plants can absorb that nitrogen as it takes in water and get the nitrogen that it needs to make its DNA. The third type is called commensalism, and this is the one that most people don't know about. Commensalism is basically one creature is helped and the other creature could really care less. This is an example of what's called Spanish moss. We see it a lot here in the South. And Spanish moss is an example of commensalism. This is an epiphyte, which means it's a plant that lives above the ground. And epiphytes draw water in from the environment. So this is why we find them in very humid areas. Well, Spanish moss and this tree is an example of commensalism. The Spanish moss is not hurting the tree. It's also not helping the tree. The tree could care less. But by holding the Spanish moss high up in the air, it helps it get sunlight and it helps it absorb the water that it needs. Okay. Another example would be barnacles that we see on things like the whales. Barnacles are small mollusks. They will attach to something like a pier, and the water, the waves, will bring nutrients to it. Well, in the case of this whale, the barnacles that are showing up here on its flipper, they are not, the skin of the whale is so thick, they are not hurting the whale in any way. The whale doesn't even realize it's there. But as the whale swims, it pulls water over the mollusk, over these barnacles, and they are filter feeders. And then we have the shark and the remora. This is also an example of commensalism. This is the remora. The remora tends to travel with the shark. It doesn't hurt the shark at all. It doesn't help the shark. The shark does not feel threatened by it. So most of the time, the shark ignores it. But at the same time, the remora is protected because nothing's going to attack that remora because it's right there by that shark. And sharks are also thrasher feeders. You guys have seen them feed, they kind of thrash their head and little pieces of fish will fall to the ground. And then the remora can kind of swoop in and grab those to eat.